Today you will hear 10 real stories from truck drivers. It's important to note that these are unique accounts, shared here for the first time on the internet. So I kindly ask for your like and subscription if you haven't subscribed yet. That being said, let's move on to the stories. The rumors about the Midnight Road were well known by all truck drivers who crossed that region. Cutting through an isolated and desolate stretch, the road wound its way between mountains and dark forests, where not a single soul could be seen. Those who drove late at night would tell stories about a strange figure that appeared on the side of the road, always dressed in black, with its back turned to the drivers. Some said the figure was a woman, others swore it was an old man wearing a hat, but everyone agreed on one detail. Those who stopped to give a ride to this presence never came back the same. João was an experienced truck driver, a man of few words and many stories. He laughed at the friends who feared the Midnight Road, thinking that the legends were just exaggerations meant to scare newcomers. Until that night, he had never had a reason to worry. But everything changed on a delivery trip that forced him to cross the road in the dead of night. It was a cold night, shrouded in thick fog, the kind of night that makes even the bravest feel uneasy. With just over a third of the trip completed, João saw something unexpected. The dark silhouette appeared on the shoulder, solitary and still. It was a tall, lean figure, standing like a statue, its face hidden by the shadows. João felt a chill, but he tried to ignore it, speeding up to leave the image behind. However, as he passed the figure, he had the strange sensation that it was watching him. When he glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw that the figure was still there, standing. Its eyes, though invisible, seemed fixed on his truck. His instinct made him speed up even more, but the feeling that something was wrong only grew stronger. A few miles later, the truck's engine began to sputter, something unprecedented for João, who always kept his vehicle in perfect condition. He found himself forced to pull over, reluctant but with no other choice. As he tried to restart the engine, he caught a familiar shadow forming in the distance. It was the same figure. It was moving slowly toward him, one step at a time, as if it knew he was trapped there. João's heart raced. Throwing one last desperate glance at the engine, he tried to ignore the figure, but it was impossible. Now it was closer, only a few meters from the truck, and he could see more clearly. It was a pale woman with long hair and deep eyes that seemed to pierce through him. João felt a strange weight on his chest, as if he were suffocating, while the air around him grew colder. The engine suddenly roared back to life, but now the figure was at his window. When he looked at her, she smiled, a cold, almost inhuman smile. "Take me, João," she whispered in a tone that was almost hypnotic. He tried to ignore her, but her eyes seemed to pull him into an unknown and terrifying world. Desperate, João slammed the truck into gear and drove off as fast as he could. Looking in the rearview mirror, he saw that the woman was still standing, watching, her smile slowly fading, but her voice echoed in the cabin, soft and sinister. The Midnight Road always demands its price. The next morning, João finally reached his destination, but his life was never the same. He tried to tell what had happened, but no one seemed to believe him. Since that night, he felt something following him, shadows lurking at every turn, whispering voices that emerged in the silence of the early hours. The Midnight Road had left its mark, and for João, it would be an eternal reminder, a dark mystery that would haunt him forever. Veteran truck drivers had an unwritten rule: never drive on foggy nights on the road that cut through the Serra do Cipó. They said that on these nights, the ghost truck would appear, a black, heavy, and imposing vehicle that would chase anyone unfortunate enough to cross its path. For many, it was just a legend to scare newcomers. But for those who had heard the growl of that eerie engine and felt the cold headlights burning toward them, the ghost truck was real. Luis, a solitary and courageous truck driver, doubted these stories. After years on the road, he had never seen anything he couldn't explain. until one strange, foggy night he received an urgent call to transport a load through the Serra do Cipó. It was the only way to get a good payment, and Luis, confident in his abilities, accepted the job. He prided himself on fearing nothing and set off on the road, covered by a fog that seemed too thick, almost supernatural. Midway through the journey, around a curve, he first spotted what seemed to be another truck behind him. The headlights were so bright that they illuminated the interior of his cabin, causing an inexplicable discomfort. When he looked in the rear-view mirror, he noticed something strange. The truck was old, with chipped and dusty paint, but it had a strange, almost spectral glow. For a moment, Luis thought it might be another trucker playing a prank on him, but he quickly realized that wasn't the case. Something about the way the truck approached seemed wrong. Not paying much attention to it, Luis tried to pull away, speeding up to leave the old truck behind. But the faster he went, the closer the other truck seemed to get, until the headlights were blinding him completely. The roar of the engine was deafening, almost like the growl of something alive, something that wanted him with an unsettling intensity. Luis began to feel real fear, a fear he couldn't explain. With each curve, the ghostly truck seemed to follow his movements effortlessly. Pushing the truck to its maximum speed, he found himself approaching a narrow tunnel. It was a dangerous spot on the road where any slip-up could result in disaster. As he entered the tunnel, the sound of the other truck's engine echoed in his ears, as if it were inside his own cabin. Luis saw the walls of the tunnel flickering with the ghostly glow of the pursuing truck's headlights. And then suddenly, everything went silent. The light from the headlights disappeared, the roar of the engine vanished, and the tunnel was filled with a deathly silence. Luis breathed a sigh of relief, thinking the nightmare was finally over. But as he exited the tunnel and looked in the rearview mirror, he froze. The ghost truck was still there, even closer now. This time, he could see the driver, a pale, expressionless man, his eyes fixed and empty, as if he were staring directly into Luis's soul. Luis floored the accelerator in panic, trying to escape that haunted gaze, but he realized there was no escaping. The ghost truck was determined to follow him to the end. Finally, as he took a sharp turn, Luis lost control of the vehicle and veered off the road, stopping only when his truck got stuck in the mud. Desperate, he jumped out of the cabin and ran to the middle of the road, but as he looked around, he realized the ghost truck had vanished. There was no sign of another vehicle, only the dense fog that seemed to be watching him. Exhausted and shaken, Luis waited until dawn, but even in the daylight, he could never forget the look of the ghost truck's driver. From that day on, Luis avoided the Serra do Cipó road and warned all other truck drivers he met. He knew the ghost truck was out there waiting for its next victim, chasing those who dared to challenge it in the night fog. And every time he heard about a missing truck driver, he knew the black truck had claimed another victim, taking them into the world of shadows and oblivion. The legend of Kilometer 66 was told at every truck stop. It was said that, on the darkest nights, a woman in white would appear along that stretch of highway, always asking for a ride. The older drivers claimed that, upon looking into her eyes, the trucker would be overwhelmed by a sense of despair, and once she entered the truck, no one ever saw her leave. Raimundo, a skeptical and brave truck driver, would laugh at these stories. He had been driving across the country for almost 30 years and had never seen anything he couldn't explain. However, one moonless night, he received a request for an urgent delivery. The destination was the very highway where the famous Kilometer 66 was located. Ignoring his friend's warnings, he set off, unconcerned, with only his headlights illuminating the empty road. As he neared the dreaded point, a strange feeling began to grow in Raimundo, somewhere between restlessness and fear. Nonsense, he thought, trying to shake off the feeling. But as soon as he passed the sign for Kilometer 66, he saw a feminine figure in the distance, standing by the shoulder. She was motionless, surrounded by a faint mist, with almost translucent skin glowing in the headlights. Even though he didn't want to, something made him slow down. As he approached, he saw the woman's face. She was young, with a sad expression and fixed eyes, as if waiting for him. She raised her hand, asking for a ride, and Raimundo felt a chill run through him. Not understanding why he was doing it, he stopped the truck, and the woman silently climbed into the cabin, sitting beside him without saying a word. The silence between them was heavy, almost suffocating. Raimundo tried to make small talk, but the woman simply stared ahead with a vacant and dark gaze. When he asked her name, she finally looked at him. "I'm lost. For a long time," she whispered. Her voice was cold and distant, and Raimundo felt his chest tighten. He wanted to believe she was just a lost traveler, but when he looked at her hands, he noticed they were far too pale, almost colorless. After a few minutes, the cabin grew colder, and Raimundo began to hear whispers like ancient voices calling to him. Trying to keep his composure, he drove in silence, but when he glanced at the woman again, he realized her eyes had changed. Now they were completely dark, as deep as an abyss. The feeling of being lost overtook him, and the road seemed endless, as if he were trapped on that stretch forever. Finally, Raimundo spotted a sharp curve, and on impulse, he suddenly swerved the wheel. The truck skidded and almost went off the road. When he managed to regain control and looked beside him, the woman was gone. Only the dark emptiness of the night remained, and the strange cold in the cabin had vanished. The next day, when he recounted what had happened, his friends fell silent. One of them, an older truck driver, explained that the woman of kilometer 66 had been a young girl who had disappeared at that very curve many years before, in an accident that was never fully explained. Since then, she had appeared to those traveling the road at night, seeking company for her eternal loneliness. Raimundo was never the same. He continued driving but always avoided kilometer 66. And with every story of another truck driver who had disappeared at that curve, he would feel a shiver down his spine. The woman in white was still there, waiting, searching for someone else to take her home, a home she would never find. Some say the worst sound for a truck driver is the sound of a broken chain. But on that forgotten road in the backcountry, the sound of the chain had a much darker meaning. It was the noise that some drivers claimed to hear, as if an invisible chain were dragging something in the shadows of the night. According to local legends, that sound preceded the appearance of a terrifying figure, a creature bound to the past and filled with hatred, seeking revenge. Elias knew the road and the legends well, but he never paid much attention to them. On a quiet early morning, he found himself traveling down that empty, dark stretch of highway. The wind made strange sounds around his truck, and the only noise accompanying him was the hum of the engine. Suddenly, at the sharpest curve, he heard a metallic scraping sound on the asphalt. He looked around, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. He thought it might be the truck itself, something caught in the cargo, but the sound wouldn't stop. As he continued, the sound grew louder, now seeming to come closer. He turned off the radio and rolled down the window, trying to hear better. It was then that he saw it in the rearview mirror. A hunched figure, wrapped in rusted chains, dragging them behind. The man appeared to be dressed in old, worn clothes, and his eyes glowed with a red, intense light, fixed on Elias as if condemning him for something he didn't understand. Trying to stay calm, Elias accelerated, but the sound of the chains continued, now echoing down the empty road. The figure kept following him, and the reddish glow of the eyes seemed closer than before. Elias then remembered the stories he'd heard at the truck stops. They said this was the spirit of a slave who had tried to escape, but was caught and killed nearby. His spirit, unable to rest, wandered the road, looking for anyone who dared cross his path at night. No matter how hard he tried to flee, the truck seemed to stall, as if something invisible was holding it back. The sound of the chains grew louder, and Elias began to feel a biting cold invade the cabin. It was as if icy hands were gripping him, pulling him out. He tried to push down the accelerator, but the pedal was heavy, almost immobile beneath his foot. In a desperate act, he began to pray, murmuring hasty words as fear took over his body. It was at that moment that, out of nowhere, the sound of the chains stopped. The road fell into a terrifying silence, and the truck seemed to finally break free of the invisible weight. Elias took a deep breath, his heart still racing. He looked in the rearview mirror, but saw nothing. The road was empty again, as if the spirit had vanished into the air without leaving a trace. When he reached the next stop, Elias shared his experience with the other truck drivers, but many just shook their heads, as if they already knew what he was talking about. One of the veterans simply said, "The sound of the chain is a warning. Whoever hears it carries that memory forever." Since that night, Elias never crossed that stretch after sunset again, fearing that next time, the spirit of the chain wouldn't let him go so easily. There was an old, rusty, narrow bridge in the interior of Mato Grosso, known for its dark and abandoned appearance. For truck drivers, crossing it was always an uncomfortable experience, especially at night. But what made the place truly terrifying was the story of a girl who appeared there on nights with dense fog. They said she waited by the side of the bridge asking for help, and that any truck driver who stopped to assist her was never seen again. Pedro was one of those brave truck drivers who doubted all the ghost stories. He always said the greatest danger on the roads was recklessness, not ghosts. One night, while crossing the region on his way to a new destination, he saw the fog starting to form. The road was empty, and the headlights of his truck barely lit the way through the thick mist. Suddenly, the bridge appeared ahead, and Pedro slowed down, feeling an unexpected shiver. As he crossed the bridge slowly, he saw a silhouette by the side of the road. It was a girl with long dark hair, wearing a white dress, staring directly at him. Pedro slowed down even more, intrigued by her presence in such a remote and desolate place. She raised her hand, asking for help, and upon seeing her pale face and pleading eyes, Pedro felt a strange empathy, something that made him stop the truck without thinking twice. He rolled down the window and asked if she needed help. The girl remained silent for a moment, just watching him with a vacant, almost hypnotizing gaze. Finally, in a low, cold voice, she said, "Can you take me to the other side?" Pedro hesitated but gestured for her to get in. The girl climbed into the cabin and sat beside him, with no expression on her face. As they crossed the bridge, Pedro felt an increasingly heavy sensation. The girl remained in complete silence, staring at the road as if she were in another world. When they finally reached the end of the bridge, he turned to ask where he should drop her off, but as he looked at the seat next to him, he realized it was empty. The girl had disappeared. Pedro stopped the truck, still in disbelief, looking around. It was then that he felt a deep cold run down his spine, and, in the silence of the night, he heard a faint whisper, as if her voice was still there, saying, "Thank you, but I will never leave." Frightened, he accelerated the truck and drove away without looking back. When he reached the next stop, he told the other truck drivers what had happened, and they confirmed the story he had previously thought was just a legend. They said that decades ago, a young woman had fallen from that bridge during a crossing, and her body was never found. Since then, her spirit wandered there, waiting for someone to take her to the other side. But according to the old drivers, she would never rest. Pedro never crossed that bridge at night again, and he always told the story of the girl on the bridge to the new truck drivers as a warning. After all, he knew she was still there, waiting for the next person who dared to stop and offer her a ride. The more experienced truck drivers avoided talking about the road of the faceless, unless they were in good company, at busy stops. For many, it was just a legend of fear and superstition, but those who claimed to have seen something knew the danger was real. They said a faceless truck driver wandered that remote road in the interior of Goiás, appearing on the darkest nights. Whoever saw him never forgot, and those who stopped to speak with him were never seen again. João was a truck driver who knew the region but had never heard this story. On one of his night trips through that stretch, he noticed that something seemed different about the road. It was a quiet, cold night, the asphalt empty and lifeless. In the distance, he saw a figure walking by the roadside. The figure was dressed in an old, dusty jumpsuit and a worn beret. Intrigued and feeling an inexplicable curiosity, Jerome slowed down and prepared to offer help. When the truck stopped next to the man, Jerome looked out the window but couldn't see the stranger's face. There was only a blur, as if the man had no defined features, just a shadow where his face should have been. Startled, Jerome blinked and looked again, thinking he was imagining things, but the faceless figure remained there, still staring at him silently. The man raised his hand and gestured, asking for a ride. Despite the growing fear, Jerome hesitated for a moment and, against all his survival instincts, signaled for the man to get in. The faceless truck driver entered without a sound, sitting stiffly in the passenger seat. Jerome tried to strike up a conversation, but the man remained silent, only pointing to the road, indicating that Jerome should continue driving. As they drove on, Jerome began to feel increasingly uneasy, as if a dense, cold presence was suffocating him. The truck seemed heavier, the air inside the cabin almost suffocating. He tried to look at the man again, but where there should have been a face, there was only darkness, a terrifying absence that seemed to pull him into an abyss. Jerome gripped the wheel, struggling against the panic, while a whispering voice echoed in his mind. "I need to get home." Overcome with desperation, Jerome slammed on the brakes and screamed, demanding that the stranger get out of the truck. However, when he looked at the passenger seat, he realized the man had disappeared. The door was closed, and there was no sign that anyone had been there. Gasping for breath, Jerome got out of the truck to make sure he was alone, but the road was empty and silent. When he reached the next truck stop, still shaking with fear, he told the other drivers what had happened. The older ones just nodded, confirming that he wasn't the first to see the faceless truck driver. The legend said that the man had been a truck driver who died in an accident many years ago, trying to return home. Since then, his spirit had wandered the road, waiting for someone who could take him to his destination. Jerome decided never to take that route again at night. And every time he saw a new truck driver in the area, he would tell the story of the faceless truck driver, warning them never to stop on that road. After all, he knew that once someone stared into that faceless darkness, it would never disappear from their memory. The Road of Shadows was a nearly forgotten shortcut by many drivers and truckers, a winding and deserted stretch that cut through a remote area of dense forest. Those who ventured there at night always reported a feeling of oppression, as if something invisible was watching them from within the shadows. The truckers said that on certain nights they could see shadowy figures along the road, shapes that appeared only from the corner of their eyes and vanished when they tried to look directly at them. Ricardo, an experienced truck driver, decided to take the Road of Shadows on a moonless night. He was running late and needed to shorten the route to reach his destination. He knew the stories, but he was skeptical and thought the reports were just fabrications. At first, the road seemed peaceful, enveloped in a dense silence that, in a way, comforted him. But as he continued, the atmosphere began to change, becoming darker and more oppressive with each passing mile. Suddenly, the headlights of his truck illuminated a dark figure at the edge of the road. It was a woman, pale, wearing a flowing black dress that seemed to float rather than walk. He saw her for just a second, because as soon as he tried to focus on her, she disappeared into the darkness. Startled, Ricardo swallowed hard and accelerated, trying to shake off the discomfort that now gripped him. But a few meters ahead, the figure appeared again, this time right in the middle of the road. Ricardo slammed on the brakes, his heart racing. The woman was staring at him, her eyes glowing with a reddish hue, and before he could react, she disappeared again, as if she were a mirage. He took a deep breath and tried to convince himself that he was just tired, but the feeling of being watched lingered. He resumed his journey, keeping his eyes fixed ahead, determined to ignore anything he might see around him. However, as he continued, the shadows seemed to come alive. He saw figures along the road, shadows that moved as if they were living creatures, ready to attack at any moment. He felt as if something was following him, an invisible weight that made the truck cabin feel small and claustrophobic. A whispering voice seemed to fill the air, saying words he couldn't understand, but that made him uneasy and afraid. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of tension, Ricardo saw the exit from the road in the distance and accelerated, determined to leave that nightmare behind. When he finally emerged from the road of shadows, he parked at the first stop he found, sweating and still trembling. As he told the story to other truckers, he heard similar accounts, stories of figures that only appeared to those who passed alone at night. From that night on, Ricardo decided to avoid the road of shadows, just like many others who had also witnessed its dark mysteries. After all, he knew those shadows were not mere illusions. They were something more, something he hoped never to encounter again. It was late at night when Fernando, a veteran truck driver, was driving along the road that cut through a desolate region of the northeast hinterlands. He had passed his planned schedule and was tired, but he refused to stop until he found a rest stop. As he drove, the sound of the engine and the darkness around him made him feel an overwhelming sense of loneliness. He began to notice the road ahead with a strange feeling, as if the night was thicker and heavier than usual. At some point, something caught his attention. A man appeared walking by the side of the road, his thumb outstretched in a gesture asking for a ride. It seemed odd that someone would be out there, on such an isolated stretch at that hour. But Fernando slowed down, and as he got closer, he realized the man was dressed in old clothes, with a straw hat and a worn-out jacket. There was something in his eyes that Fernando couldn't quite identify, a deep sadness perhaps, or an ancient weariness. The man waved again, and Fernando, hesitant, decided to open the truck door for him. The stranger climbed in silently, his expression serious and mysterious. Fernando tried to make conversation, asking where the man was headed, but the hitchhiker only replied that he needed to get home before dawn. The vague answer made Fernando uneasy, but he dismissed it, thinking that perhaps the man was just someone exhausted and lost. As they continued in silence, Fernando noticed the environment becoming colder, despite the usual heat of the region. A shiver ran down his spine, and he felt the air inside the cabin grow heavier, almost suffocating. He tried to focus on the road, but couldn't shake the growing discomfort, as if he were carrying something much darker than just a mere passenger. Finally, after several miles, the hitchhiker broke the silence and spoke in a low voice. "You've taken me far enough. Now I can rest." Confused, Fernando looked at the man and asked if he wanted to get off right there. When he turned to the passenger seat, he saw that the man had vanished. There was no sign of the door being opened, and the seatbelt was still fastened, as if no one had ever been there. Startled, Fernando pulled over to the shoulder and got out to search for an explanation, but everything around him was quiet and deserted. Trembling, he returned to the truck, started the engine, and sped up, determined to leave that stretch of road as quickly as possible. When he reached a truck stop, he told the story to his fellow drivers, who exchanged serious, worried looks. The older ones confirmed that many had seen the same hitchhiker on that road, a lost man who had died decades earlier while trying to return to his family. Since then, his soul had wandered, accepting rides and disappearing mysteriously. Fernando decided that from then on, he would think twice before offering a ride to any stranger in the early morning hours. After all, he knew that the hitchhiker of the night was still waiting for the next chance to catch a ride into eternity. On a moonless night, Sergio, an experienced truck driver, was driving through a deserted highway in the interior of Minas Gerais. It was a quiet dawn, and he was used to traveling this stretch, but something felt different at that moment. The sky was completely overcast and he couldn't see the stars. The darkness seemed to swallow everything around him, and the road was empty, with no other vehicles in sight. But as he drove, he started to feel a presence, as if something was watching him. That's when he saw the other truck for the first time. In the distance, just a silhouette illuminated by low beams. Strangely, the vehicle seemed to be moving at the same speed as his, though he couldn't make out the details of the truck ahead. With every kilometer, the truck seemed closer, as if it was following him. Sergio accelerated, trying to overtake the vehicle, but no matter how hard he tried, the other truck remained at the same distance, keeping a steady and unusual pace. Worried, Sergio decided to speed up even more. The road stretched ahead in a straight line, and he knew that at some point, he would have to pass it. But before he could get close enough, the lights of the other truck began to shine with a blinding intensity. He tried to look away, but something forced him to keep his eyes on those lights, as if a supernatural force were controlling his vision. Suddenly, the lights disappeared completely, and Sergio was immersed in the most absolute darkness. He tried to switch on his high beams, but the truck's electrical system seemed to have failed. Unable to see the road ahead, he slowed down, his heart racing. That's when he saw something even stranger. The truck that had been ahead, now completely stopped, with the engine off, no sign of life. Sergio approached slowly, not understanding what was happening. When he finally reached the side of the truck, he looked inside the cabin and saw a hooded figure, but he couldn't make out the driver's face. It was as though the man was deeply asleep, or perhaps in a trance-like state. However, something didn't feel right. The air was heavy, and he felt an inexplicable chill. Determined to continue his journey, Sergio started the truck again, not stopping to investigate further. When he looked in the rearview mirror, he saw the truck still standing still. But when he turned his eyes to the road ahead, he realized that for some reason, the lights of the other truck were now much closer. The driver seemed to be following him, but without accelerating, without hurry. That truck wouldn't leave him alone. Sergio spent the next few minutes, growing more anxious, trying to shake off the feeling of being chased. Then, when he looked in the rearview mirror again, the truck had completely disappeared. Startled and without an explanation, he sped up even more, finally reaching the next gas station. When he told the story to the other truckers at the station, they fell silent, their eyes serious and attentive. Finally, one of the older drivers approached and said, "You saw the driver of the eclipse." According to him, there were legends about a trucker who, on a solar eclipse night, had lost his life in an accident on that very road. Since then, he appeared to other drivers, always following them until fear took hold and they drove away. No one knew for sure whether it was a vengeful spirit or a lost trucker looking for company. Sergio, now more uncomfortable than ever, decided never to travel at night on that stretch again. But whenever he looked up at the sky during an eclipse, he felt an eerie sensation that the engine of that other truck could still be heard, trying to catch up with him once more. Carlos was driving alone on the highway that cut through the interior of São Paulo. It was a cold and foggy night, typical of autumn, and he was used to crossing this stretch, although the fog, especially at night, always left him a bit uncomfortable. The truck's headlights cut through the thick layer of mist, but it seemed like the road ahead never fully cleared. Visibility was very poor, and he was starting to feel tired from concentrating so hard on the road ahead. Then he saw it. In the distance, a faint light stood out against the thick fog, like the reflection of a headlight. At first, Carlos thought it was another truck, but as he got closer, he realized that the vehicle was in poor condition. The truck appeared old, covered in a layer of dust and rust. The lights were off, except for the low beams that dimly illuminated the road ahead, and the vehicle was moving very slowly, as if it were broken down. Intrigued, Carlos decided to get closer and offer help. He pressed the accelerator, determined to pass and check the condition of the other truck. As he got closer, the driver didn't seem to react. The truck was almost stationary, parked in the middle of the road, and Carlos began to wonder what was going on. He honked the horn several times but got no response. The vehicle remained there motionless, with no sign of life. When he passed by, the fog briefly parted, and Carlos got a fright. The driver of the truck was visibly pale, with a fixed, unblinking stare, as if in a trance. But the strangest thing was that the man's face was covered by a veil of thick mist, as if he wasn't entirely physical. Instinctively, Carlos looked forward, trying to ignore the discomfort he felt. But when he glanced in the rearview mirror, the truck had vanished. The road behind him was clear, with no trace of the vehicle. Startled, he tried to focus again on the road, but something still bothered him. He kept accelerating, trying to distance himself from the vision, but the feeling of being followed grew stronger. Every time he looked in the rearview mirror, the fog seemed denser, and in the midst of it, he could swear he saw the silhouette of the truck, stationary and then fading away. He started to feel a weight on his chest, as though he was no longer alone. Finally, the fog began to dissipate slightly, and he spotted the gas station ahead. Carlos made sure to stop, panting, and got out of the truck to take a walk and clear his mind. When he told his story to other drivers, one of them, older and with a serious expression, said the road was known as the Fog Road, a place where many truckers had mysteriously disappeared in recent years. According to him, there were rumors that on foggy nights, a ghost truck with a driver condemned to wander the road after a tragedy appeared to those brave enough to pass through. Carlos went silent for a moment, trying to process what he had just heard. A chill ran down his spine, for he knew that what he had experienced that night couldn't simply be explained away as a trick of the mind. He now knew that the road, with its thick, mysterious fog, wasn't just a dangerous stretch for drivers. It was a place where the supernatural met the loneliness of endless highways.